Hello everyone and welcome into what is going to be the last video in Chapter 1 of Biotechnology. We are going to talk about bioethics. So bioethics refers to the need for integrity and morality in the field of biology and medicine, and of course that includes biotechnology as well. So we've talked before in defining biotechnology that essentially it is understanding biology and science well enough to get cells to be manipulated into doing the sorts of things that we want them to do. We can get cells to produce products that we need. Well, the idea here is that just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean it's right to do that or that you should do that, right? So we've already mentioned various government agencies like the USDA, the EPA, the FDA, etc. They place restrictions on the production and use of various technologies to make sure that they're being used for their intended purposes. So take Monsanto, for example. They make a pesticide called Roundup that I'm sure you've heard of before. Well, Roundup is very strictly regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency and the USDA to make sure that it's only being used as a pesticide. We don't want to let loose of these regulations, and then next thing you know, Hank Scorpio is getting his hands on Roundup and putting it in the drinking water to poison all of us. So that would be no good. So not every technology is safe in all applications, so we regulate these things to make sure that they are being used the way that they are supposed to be used. So really, in most cases, the need for ethical behavior in biotechnology largely stems from our manipulation of different organisms. So for laboratory animals like mice and rats and things of that nature, mostly vertebrate animals, so animals that have spinal cords, they are protected by institutional committees called IACUC, or Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Every institute forms their own IACUC, basically a group of scientists and some veterinarians to make sure that protocols for how laboratory animals are going to be handled and used are being followed and that everything is being done humanely. So your takeaway here should be that IACUC is not just something that an Italian chef tells you when you ask him what he does for a living, right? So human test subjects are protected by something else called the Institutional Review Board. It's the same sort of thing to make sure that for things like clinical trials in which humans are your test subjects, you're making sure that all the correct protocols are being followed, right? So one of the best examples of bioethics, and we're not going to turn this into a whole bioethics course, but this is probably the most famous example of it, the Hwang stem cell case. So just to give you a little bit of background, a South Korean researcher by the name of Woo-suk Hwang, very famous scientist back in the early 2000s. He was at Seoul National University in South Korea. He got famous because his lab apparently had this monumental achievement of generating pluripotent stem cells from a cloned human embryo. That's basically unheard of, right? So a pluripotent stem cell is a stem cell that can basically differentiate into any type of cell, right? So this was huge news because it meant very important things for things like stem cell therapy, for helping people with heart attacks and neurodegenerative diseases. This was a very important discovery. So Woo-suk Hwang stood to profit very much so. His lab was going to shoot off and everything was going to be great. Well, not long after he published his work in Science, which is a very high, very top-of-the-line journal, his work began to unravel under closer scrutiny. So there were two major ethical problems with his work. The first, and as bad as it sounds, this is the more minor of the offenses, he collected eggs, meaning actual ova, from the ovaries of female researchers in his lab. This is a big, big, big no-no. This is skirting IRB protocol, or whatever the South Korean equivalent of IRB is. Major violation of ethical codes. Apparently these female researchers were coerced in some way to giving up their eggs and donating them. Big, 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 big no-no. You have to obtain your research materials through legitimate means and through ethical and well-sourced means. Okay, and number two, this is the big, big problem. A lot of his work was just total BS. A lot of his data were falsified. So many of the figures and data in his paper were either misleading or downright falsified in terms of where the data came from. So there were microscope pictures that were apparently copied and pasted from different places and then rotated to make it look like they were new images. The whole thing was just very shoddily done. So, including some micrographs claiming to represent human data were actually from parthenogenic organisms, in which case stem cell biology works a little bit differently there and is maybe a little bit easier to manipulate. So, huge problems with these data, and this led to Hwang eventually being totally disgraced and barred from participating in any scientific career for a long time. That was 16 years ago, though, and he has apparently since then regained his career as a kind of minor in the background researcher. But this is a huge blemish on his name, and this blemish is never ever going to go away. So whenever I talk about bioethics, I basically put it this way. There are always going to be temptations to do things that are not right. Okay, so you feel like you're doing your experiments, you're doing your research, you feel like you're just on the cusp of a breakthrough, but an experiment that would have finished things off doesn't go right. So you feel like, if only this experiment looked better, if only the data looked better, I'd be well on my way. So you might feel compelled to maybe fudge things a little bit here and there, but here's the thing. These things are always going to unravel under scrutiny. Someone is always going to find out. These things are never going to be kept secret. So there is really no good reason to do anything the way that they are not supposed to be done. These things are always going to come to light. So if you would like to read more about the Hwang stem cell case, it really is a fascinating case study in this, you can click on this link here and read up on it. So I just kind of gave you the highlights here. All right, so that is going to do it for Chapter 1 in Biotechnology. I hope you have enjoyed this, what you might call a taste of what biotechnology is going to be like. So join us for Chapter 2, and we will start talking about some foundational stuff for our studies moving forward. So I hope you will join us then, and I will go ahead and sign off and see you next time. Bye-bye.